Nuclear weapons as protectors of peace. It's called nuclear deterrence, but does it work? This is Roundtable with me, Matthew Moore. Well, it is the theory that countries with nuclear weapons won't use them on each other for fear of retaliation. Historically, it's been shown to work. But in a time when the United States and North Korea are threatening to attack each other, does it still apply? Since the end of World War II, when the first nuclear bombs were dropped, wreaking havoc and destruction on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 8 other countries have acquired nuclear bombs. But there have been no nuclear attacks for over 70 years. Are the weapons built to kill and destroy on a mass scale actually serving to pacify? Or are tensions between nuclear nations bringing us closer to nuclear annihilation?
North Korea best not make any more threats to the United States. They will be met with fire and fury like the world has never seen.
The forthcoming measures by DPRK will make the U.S. suffer the greatest pain it's never experienced in its history.
Nuclear deterrence. It's the idea that countries with nuclear weapons won't go to war with each other because of mutual assured destruction.
It has the word terror inside it, right? Deterrence, that's what it's about, is you scare somebody away from doing something you don't want them to do by making them fear the consequences.
Some argue that more nuclear weapons may be better for stability, as weapons for peace rather than war. Despite there being over 15,000 nuclear weapons in the world, there's never been a nuclear war, although some say North Korea and the United States are close. Almost all countries with nuclear weapons are modernizing them, raising questions about whether the world is heading towards a nuclear arms race.
People have been accepting nuclear weapons as legitimate tools for providing security for 70 years now. And we're trying to change the mindset, really, that it's not acceptable to threaten to level an entire city just to keep yourself secure.
The presence of nuclear weapons doesn't guarantee safety. History has shown that those who do not have large atomic arsenals are not always deterred by those who do. In 1950, China sent its armies to attack US military forces in the Korean War. America's nuclear weapons didn't deter the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And despite India and Pakistan acquiring nuclear weapons, war erupted between the two neighbors in 1999. So are nuclear weapons the answer to peace? The theory of nuclear deterrence assumes those who possess them will act rationally, a premise that could be disproved with the flick of a switch. Well, joining me at the roundtable today is the chairman of the Korean Friendship Association in the UK, Dermot Hudson. He believes that North Korea would not launch a nuclear attack, at least not before the United States. To my right is Dr. Grant Christopher. He's the program director at the think tank Ridgeway. He says nuclear weapons were helpful in managing the Cold War. On my left is Timothy Stafford from the think tank, the Henry Jackson Society. He says nuclear weapons only keep the world safe in the right hands. And we have Ian Chamberlain from the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. Ian Chamberlain, let's start with you. It's a pretty obvious point. We haven't had a World War III, and that's as a result of having nuclear weapons.
That is the standard deterrence argument, but I think what we're seeing at the moment is the breakdown of that deterrence argument with terrible nuclear brinkmanship, this war of words between the US and North Korea. When you're on the brink of war, you can see how nuclear weapons far from deterring a war, could actually lead to millions and millions of people being killed in an actual nuclear war. So there has to be an alternative to the development of more nuclear weapons and an end to the threats that we're seeing at the moment.
And Dermot, your position is that nuclear weapons in North Korean hands are safe and would actually prevent further conflict.
That is correct, because when the DPRK carried out its first nuclear test on the 9th of October 2006, the DPRK government issued a statement which committed the DPRK to, first of all, no first use of nuclear weapons. Secondly, that they would not sell nuclear weapons to other countries. Thirdly, to work towards the goal of nuclear disarmament and a nuclear-free Korean peninsula.
Timothy Stafford, can you take North Korea's promises at face value?
Absolutely not. I'll give you a classic example. That Syria, for many years, has had interest in nuclear weapons under the Assad regime, and it's had well-documented cooperation with North Korea. And this, I think, is the point to some of the decisions and discussions we've already started to have, which is nuclear weapons can be a force stability in the right hands. If you look at the policy that the United States, the United Kingdom have had of providing extended deterrence guarantees to other countries, it's disincentivized them from going and acquiring weapons themselves, and therefore there's been not the level of proliferation that we thought that there would be in, say, the 1960s. But if you look at other countries that have acquired nuclear weapons, Pakistan is an instance of this. They've used it to be more assertive in their conventional military posture and bring about repeated crises with India. So it depends on whose hands these weapons are in.
And is that an analysis you'd agree with?
I would say that for North Korea, we didn't want them to develop nuclear weapons. We don't want other states to develop nuclear weapons. Simply for the reason more countries means there's more likely to be a crisis, a problem. The more nuclear weapons there are, we increase the chance of a serious accident. There are many instances in every country that has possessed nuclear weapons of pretty serious safety and accident situations. A couple of years ago, 3 years ago, missile officers in the US were cheating on their tests. They have exams every month to check that they can operate nuclear weapons safely, and they were cheating. That happened in the United States. This could be going on in other countries. What's North Korean safety and security like for their nuclear arsenal?
Dermot?
Well, I mean, first of all, I'd like to come back on what Timothy Stafford said. I mean, where did the evidence come from that A, Syria had a nuclear weapons program, B, that it was being assisted by the DPRK? The evidence only came from the US and I believe the Israelis, who are a very belligerent party in the Middle East. I mean, secondly, I mean, with nuclear safety, well, I mean, it's as safe as any kind of weapon. You could apply that argument to any kind of process that involves danger in industry.
I mean, the existing nuclear states have said that they would, in good faith, work towards the abolition of nuclear weapons, and we've just not seen that. We have seen new countries develop nuclear weapons programs, and we've not seen enough countries like the US and Britain giving up their own nuclear arsenal. At the moment at the UN, there's a treaty open to signature later this month, signed by or supported by 122 countries, which is all about working towards a world without nuclear weapons. But Britain, the US, have decided not to participate in those talks. Why? You know, why isn't Donald Trump being condemned for that? Why isn't the British government being condemned for that?
Timothy Stafford, you were saying that when countries possess nuclear weapons, it can affect their calculations in going to war in a conventional, more limited means. And how would you think North Korea's calculations would change if they had the sort of nuclear arsenal and capabilities that they're seeking?
Well, I think the point that I'd make is if you look at the history of nuclear weapons development, countries that newly acquire nuclear weapons, particularly those that have a revisionist view of history, particularly those which are already engaged in some degree of hostility with their neighbours, tend to be more aggressive. You've seen this in the case of Pakistan, I mentioned, with the Kashmir issue. And I think that is the concern about North Korea, that there are repeated provocations between the North and the South, that the North regularly engages in, and that would be much more likely to exacerbate if and when the North Koreans feel that they have a working nuclear arsenal capable of deterring external intervention.
Yeah, what you're missing out is that the only country in the world to have used nuclear weapons twice is the US, and they actually use.
That's actually not really relevant to what he was saying. He was saying that if North Korea had nuclear weapons, their ability to try to attack their neighbours, for example, would be increased because they're protected.
Well, there again, I mean, my impression is that he's trying to say that the US and one or two other countries are the only countries in the world to be trusted with nuclear weapons. And in fact, if you look at the history of the US, since 1945, they've been involved in numerous wars, such as the Korean War, Iraq War, Vietnam War, and so on. They've intervened in many countries. They've instigated coups in many countries.
And they've had the protection of nuclear weapons. So,
yes, so
what's to say North Korea would not feel
why is the DPRK being blamed and not the US?
Well, you just want to give the North Koreans the equal status to go about behaving in a bad way, as you've just pointed out.
Yeah, I mean, try and directly answer the question. I mean, in fact, it's a well-known fact that in fact the DPRK would be able to use conventional weapons anyway if a war broke out between the DPRK and the US and the South Korean forces.
Exactly. So why does North Korea need nuclear weapons? Because they already had an effective deterrent. They had forces that could conventionally attack the South. Seoul is 30 kilometers from the North. I mean, most of the South Korean population lives well within range of any attack, and this is what would deter the US and allies from acting in the North.
I mean, can I just say that, it's absolutely right that North Korea should not be developing nuclear weapons right now, and it is obviously very provocative. But I do think it's a tragedy, actually, that there have been offers on the table for talks for North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons program. The last example of this was in 2015 when we had President Obama. There was an offer from China and North Korea for the abandonment of the nuclear weapons program, and Obama just simply said, no, I'm not going to sit down and talk. So when there's that sort of attitude to diplomatic means, that's why we're in a situation where things could turn militarily very nasty.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely correct. I mean, the DPRK has always argued for a negotiated settlement. And in fact, in the 90s, you had the DPRK-US agreed framework where they froze their nuclear program, and the US basically ruined that. First of all, Clinton delayed the implementation of the US side of the bargain, and then Bush basically negated the whole thing.
Okay, let's talk about Iran for a moment. Are you satisfied that program is going well? Monitoring and preventing them from getting nuclear weapons?
I mean, who cares what I think? The IAEA has said Iran is in compliance. The people that are supposed to check that Iran is in compliance have said Iran is in compliance. We've had very concerning statements from the US ambassador to the UN, claiming there are hundreds of sites where there could be scope for Iran cheating. I think the use of that big number was concerning because, well, maybe she's lying but exaggerating, like maybe it's 20, 50, it's zero. There are no sites that we are aware of where Iran has been cheating. That doesn't mean there aren't, but there aren't known sites where Iran is cheating, and, the US is trying to push.
And did it make the world a safer place by making sure they didn't develop nuclear weapons?
I think it would. Iran is a nuclear state. Again, for the arguments, the same arguments apply as I was making before about North Korea. For regional security, a completely different set of arguments. But I think the the general principles of we don't want more countries with nuclear weapons, more people looking at each other trying to work out what's going on, more instances where a crisis could turn into accidentally escalate into a full-blown war with nuclear exchange. That's bad.
Had Iran actually gone down the road and achieved nuclear weapons, that would have potentially changed their foreign policy towards their Gulf neighbours and in the way they fund certain groups like Hezbollah, potentially.
Well, I'd just say a couple of points. I mean, just on the first point, when we're talking about the Iranian nuclear agreement that is in place, I broadly agree with the view that it has halted Iran's nuclear progress as it is. That said, the deal expires in a number of years, at which point the restrictions on Iran's program come off. So this diplomatic arrangement was to try to kickstart better relations. We've not really seen that. So whilst on the tactical level it's essentially halted the Iranian nuclear program in place, it hasn't necessarily solved that equation once and for all.
I just want to go back on that a bit. So the IAEA is back in Iran. They have the normal provisions that they have in other states, the Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement, the additional protocol. They also have additional arrangements that come in through the Iran deal to monitor additional powers. The IAEA will stay in after everything else expires. They will monitor Iran's activities, and so not everything is expiring. So there are holds in place of Iran's centrifuge technology development and missile technology development. They expire, and I think you can make an argument for we were hoping that on these cases, maybe with this diplomatic breakthrough, there could be some additional talks to limit their missile development activity.
Typically, there was a point that Dermot made earlier, which perhaps we didn't explore enough, which was that the United States is the only country to have used nuclear weapons, and possibly others would say also about Iran that they haven't attacked anybody in a couple of centuries. Why shouldn't they be entitled to nuclear weapons? It would make the world no less safe. What do you think about that?
No, I disagree with that assessment of Iran. Firstly, the argument is often made that Iran has not attacked any of its neighbours. I think what you see is that Iran has had a very long history of supporting proxies throughout the region. Hezbollah in Lebanon, Shia militias in Iraq, other groups in Yemen, and that kind of activity would be likely to increase if Iran were to acquire nuclear weapons. And I also think there's something we haven't mentioned, this notion that, well, if one country can acquire more weapons, then that will stabilise the region. The first thing that would happen if the Iranians were to acquire nuclear weapons is that they would see moves from other countries in the Gulf region, particularly Saudi Arabia, to do the same. And therefore, once you have one country that acquires weapons, you see a domino effect. This is what we saw with India and Pakistan, for instance. So trying to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons, I think, is a perfectly legitimate thing to do to keep the Middle East more stable than it otherwise would be.
Ian, would you accept the argument there are some countries that can be trusted with nuclear weapons more than others?
No, I don't. I mean, CND, stands for the abolition of nuclear weapons held by all countries. The risks are just too great whilst we have nuclear weapons, whether it's nuclear accidents or whether it's the kind of situations we're seeing at the moment where there is nuclear brinkmanship and the possibility of a real war. And nobody would be a winner of a war with North Korea, the US North Korea, because millions of people would die on both sides.
North Korea with, say, France?
It's not a comment on the North Korean regime. Nuclear weapons just aren't safe in anyone's hands because, as I say, they could still be used, which is why I think the only alternative is to sit down and talk with the six party talks.
Does it concern you that if nuclear weapons were removed entirely from the world, that smaller conventional conflicts would come about more often?
No, it doesn't concern me because I think you have to look at the root causes of wars, and there's different reasons for different wars. I think sometimes states feel like they need to develop nuclear weapons because they are being threatened by countries, and I think we have to argue for a change of conditions so that countries don't feel like that.
India and Pakistan went to war several times before they had nuclear weapons in the 90s, and since they haven't had a proper war. They've had some minor clashes. Is that as a result of the nuclear weapons being present?
I think when thinking about why countries fight war, one of the reasons countries fight war is they think they can win. If you have nuclear weapons and you're trying to wipe out another state with nuclear weapons, you can't win. I think this is an unfortunate conclusion, but it seems like we have to really contend with that when thinking about how to get
It's a fair
rid of
point,
nuclear
isn't it, Ian?
weapons.
No, I mean, we've seen a lot of wars in the last 16 years. We've seen wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, and these are wars that nuclear-owning countries have been involved with. So the idea that nuclear weapons are a solution to war is just
That's a fair
bonkers,
point,
really.
Timothy. I mean, we are seeing, for example, in Syria, we're seeing the Russians on one side and the Americans on the other. So nuclear weapons doesn't prevent nuclear powers from fighting each other, at least by proxy.
No, but I don't think that is the argument. I don't think anyone's ever made that argument. I don't think you could make the case that the United States wouldn't have intervened in Afghanistan if it was a non-nuclear power. I don't think
Really?
you could make.
It would
absolutely.
be
I don't
madness.
think.
Absolutely.
I don't
I think he
see
means
that.
if the US didn't have nuclear weapons, it still would have been.
Oh, I
That's
see.
exactly what I mean.
Sorry,
If
yeah.
the United States was a non-nuclear power, its conventional capabilities would still be so
No,
vast.
but the point I was making is that these wars have taken place in a world where there's a lot of nuclear weapons. So we need to, if we want to get, it's not that we just don't want more wars. How do we tackle the wars that we have at the moment? Nuclear weapons aren't a solution.
Would the wars would be on a greater scale and worse? That's the issue, isn't it?
Well, look, I think there are certain instances where you have to look at the particular deterrent relationships themselves. If you look at the situation between the United States and Russia, I think there is no doubt that the Russians would have been much more cautious about intervening in Crimea were they not a nuclear state. At the same time, the Americans might have been more emboldened in responding were Russia not a nuclear state. So it depends on the individual circumstances. I don't think you can say that nuclear weapons automatically can be the solution to all war around the world, which some take. But I do make the point that in certain circumstances, in a number of situations that we have around the world today, with America's provision of its deterrent capability to NATO partners, ensuring the security of South Korea and Japan, this serves to stabilize some parts of the world which would be more hostile and more volatile without them.
But,
it's a mixed picture.
You would argue that, but for North Korea, for that area.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the fact that the DPRK has acquired a nuclear deterrent is preventing the outbreak of war on the Korean Peninsula. And, there was many wars that took place which were waged by nuclear power against non-nuclear countries. And you have the example of Libya, where Colonel Gaddafi thought he could be friends with the West, and he gave up the nuclear program. Look what happened there.
That overthrow began with the Libyan people itself and part of the Arab Spring, though.
I personally don't accept that. It was CIA and NATO instigated, and he was murdered by a mob.
Well, each of you have your positions on this, and if you were to, if we were to say, look, keep the status quo, and that would make the world safer, what would it be in your case? I mean, would you say that no more countries should gain nuclear weapons and that others should reduce the stockpiles they have? How would you go about making the world a safer place? I think that's a question on which we all ought to focus on as we come towards the end of the show.
I'm thinking that maybe even under this table we could, we all see that we don't want as many nuclear weapons, and maybe some of us want none, maybe some of us want less, but we just don't agree how to get there and what steps should be taken before we get there. More nuclear states would be a bad thing. In my view, I think it increases the risk for miscalculation. I think Timothy's argument needs to be challenged on responsible states. So let's say we're in 1947. You could make exactly the same argument about a USSR having nuclear weapons. Like that same argument would apply and be even stronger because of how the USSR was behaving. But then we've acknowledged that maybe the USSR having nuclear weapons was stabilizing. It made the US and the USSR think twice before engaging in World War III. So we need to make sure we're clear about what we think about those arguments.
What would you like to see with the current situation? What changes would you like to see to make the world less likely to enter into a big nuclear confrontation?
Certainly. I mean, look, firstly, I would agree with the point that's made that no additional nuclear weapons would be a good place to start. I think if you look at countries like Iran and North Korea, for the reasons I've mentioned, it would be wise to ensure that you don't see any major change in there. But I think the one thing that we haven't yet talked about is one of the reasons why certain deterrence relationships remain stable is because of the level of discussion and dialogue between them. The United States and Russia had extensive talks during the Cold War. Now, at the moment, the United States and China do not, because China refuses to discuss nuclear policy in official dialogues. That has got to change as months and years go forward. We need to have more discussions so that countries understand one another, understand their doctrine, understand their nuclear postures, and make sure you don't lead to the kind of uncertainty that can come when there's ambiguity.
More dialogue. And Ian, we know that you'd like to see the end of nuclear weapons altogether. Is there a chance for that coming up? Well,
There is,
for the momentum to increase. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, you know, in the last 16 years, some of the wars in the Middle East, it's often been talked about sort of joining the international community in these kind of wars. But actually, what the international community is saying at the moment, as I mentioned earlier, 122 countries are saying, is that we want to work towards a world without nuclear weapons, which is why there's this treaty open for signature on the 20th of September. Theresa May could sign that treaty. It doesn't mean Britain giving up its nuclear weapons straight away. It means beginning that journey.
Ian Chamberlain, thank you very much, and also Timothy Stafford, Dermot Hudson, and Dr. Grant Christopher. Thank you all for your time today on the Roundtable and your contributions. Well, nuclear weapons appear to have maintained a power balance between the countries that have them, albeit a shaky one in the part of the United States and North Korea. And the case can be made that we haven't had World War III, but on the other hand, it hasn't prevented many smaller scale wars from breaking out either. The nuclear shadow still hangs over all of us. I'm Matthew Moore. Thank you for watching.